Welcome, my friends. Welcome to the School of Taste, the first session in our new season of webinars. I am Nick Jackson. I'm very pleased to be with you all here today. I see some familiar names and faces are attending today, so welcome back if you've been to one of my webinars before. And if you're new, if this is the first time that you've attended one of my webinars, then you are very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I also want to give a shout out to people who are watching on the recording. There's never a perfect time to choose to start one of these sessions live, so inevitably some people have to miss out. I apologize for that, but I hope nonetheless that you enjoy the recording of this session. If when you view the recording, of course you can't ask questions live, but if you have any questions after you watch the recording, then please don't hesitate to email me. So welcome to Wine Tasting by Structure. This is my course, which I have worked on a little bit over the summer. I did practice this webinar course in the spring, and we got great feedback from that course. But since then, I have developed my ideas a little bit. I think I've got a bit of a better platform now for webinars. So hopefully you guys are going to get the benefit of that. At any time during this live session, if you guys have questions, then use the questions function, and I will read out as many of your comments and your questions as I can do. So without further ado, let's start talking about structure in wine. What do we mean by structure in wine? Well, let me just first of all advance this slide here. A little background, first of all, before we get started. All of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in today's session and in the future sessions during this webinar course comes really out of my book, which is called Beyond Flavor. Some of you may know this book, others of you may not have come across it yet, but this series of webinars is meant for me to develop the ideas, to bring to life the ideas that are in that book. So where did that book come from? Well, that book really was the emergence from my studies as a Master of Wine student. When I was taking the Master of Wine exam, I was practicing, I was training, I was tasting many wines every week in advance of the exam. And I was using the way that I'd always learned about how to taste wine, which was really to look at the flavors of each wine. And that would be your best identifying key for ascertaining whether we have a Cabernet or a Merlot or a Syrah. But I kept on getting wines wrong, and it was incredibly frustrating to me. So then I started investigating this side of wine, which I generally refer to in this big catch-all term as structure. So in red wines, which we'll come on to later in this webinar series, that means tannin structure. I think tannin structure in red wines is probably a familiar concept to any of us who are enthusiastic about wines, whether we're professionals or amateurs. Tannin being that drying sensation in the mouth. And so it wasn't too much of a step forward for me to argue that tannins aren't just a sort of random drying sensation which feels the same in every kind of red wine, but which in fact in each different variety has a slightly different texture and is felt in a slightly different place. So we'll come on to all of the details of that in the later sessions on red wine. But tannin structure, I think, is a fairly easy concept to grasp. I think a slightly more abstract, more difficult concept is the idea about acid structure. Acid structure in white wines. Of course, we do get acid in red wines and even acid structure. But I think in red wines, the predominant structural emphasis is on tannin. So we're going to leave red wines to tannin. But I really had an important moment in my wine career when I heard another Master of Wine talking about this concept of acid structure. And that's when I realized that white wines could have the same kind of structure that red wines do, but just with acid rather than with tannin. And so when I realized that, then I realized that when I tasted very carefully, I could find a different acid structure in each major white variety. And so if I really just looked when I was tasting for acid structure rather than flavor, I found that I would consistently get more wines correct. Because for instance, if you have a wine that smells of lemon or citrus or green apple. That doesn't really narrow down the options very much. On a given day, any number of wines can taste like that. But what I realized was that if you think that wine might be a Chablis or maybe a Muscadet, how do you tell the difference between those two? Well, the answer I discovered is that they have very different acid structures, very different profiles of acidity. So when I started looking at wines from this perspective, it changed my whole outlook. I realized that a better way of identifying wines blind and understanding really what these varieties are all about might be through relying on structure rather than relying on flavor. So that's why I called my book Beyond Flavor. Now, that is a bit of a provocative title, I know. And I really want to emphasize really right at the beginning of these sessions that that doesn't mean that we ignore flavor or that somehow flavor is uninteresting or useless to us. Not at all. All I'm saying is that for so long, the scales have been tipped towards flavor that I just want to rebalance it a little bit and think about structure, maybe just as much as flavor. So that's the purpose of these webinars, to try and explain a little bit about what my structural approach to wine tasting is. So that's what I mean by going beyond flavor. But let's kind of drill down now and think really what acid structure in white wine comprises of. How do I understand what acid structure is in white wines? One thing, I really have three, I guess, components to acid structure. The first, I guess, is the easiest to understand, and I think we'll all be familiar with it, which is the level of acidity in any given wine. In this, if you have, for instance, Sauvignon Blanc, which we're going to look at in just a little bit, Sauvignon Blanc is clearly a variety which tends to have high acidity. That really is a distinguishing feature of the variety. If you found one with low acidity, really it's kind of missing the point of Sauvignon Blanc. So on the other hand, you might have varieties like something like Gewürztraminer from Alsace or Pinot Gris or other varieties like that, which have naturally low acidity or lower acidity. Of course, we do experience different regional expressions, different levels of acidity varying by the climate the grapes are grown in. But in general, we can say that some varieties have got higher levels of acidity than others. So that's our first clue. How much acid does this wine have? And the simple test to answer that question is, how much does it make my mouth water? In that sense, it can be good to have a benchmark like a Sauvignon Blanc or like a Riesling, perhaps, which usually has high to very high acidity, where you think, okay, so that's my benchmark for high acidity. And then maybe you have a wine with lower acidity, maybe like a Chardonnay from a warm climate, and that can be your benchmark for lower acidity. So the first thing to assess, which is our first clue to what a grape variety might be when we're tasting the wine, is the level of acidity. The second category I refer to in acid structure is this concept of the type of acidity. What that really means is, what is the nature of the acidity? What does it feel like in the mouth? Or what is the texture or the sensation that acidity gives? Now, this can be a bit of a crazy idea when you first hear it, because you just think, oh, well, you know, acidity in wines tends just to make my mouth water, and it's a little bit tart, and all acidity is like that. Well, what I argue is that, in fact, between different varieties, they give a slightly different acid sensation in the mouth, variety by variety. So I've given on this slide here just a few examples of the terms that I use in the book to describe different varieties. I'm not going to tell you which ones these terms belong to, which varieties they belong to, but these are just some of them. And of course, the important thing here is that if you understand those terms and if they're meaningful to you, then you can use them. But if you have other terms that speak to you better, that make clearer in your own head what the nature of that acidity is like, then of course use them. This is not restrictive. And I know, you know, that we have many people watching today for whom English is not their first language. And I'm very well aware that a lot of these terms are very abstract. What's it mean, even in English, what's it mean to say a wine has got zesty acidity versus having electric acidity? These are very fine distinctions, which may only be meaningful to me. So again, just take it with a grain of salt. Don't worry too much if you don't get the exact word, but just try and understand the kind of thing I'm getting at. So that's the second aspect, the type of acidity. I guess the most difficult and probably most kind of novel idea I came up with in the book is this idea that white wines have got a certain shape to the acid structure. This is probably the hardest one to explain, so I'll do my best, but please do ask in the questions function if I'm still not making it clear. My idea is that you do not, when you put a wine in your mouth and you hold it there for say 5 seconds or 6 seconds to try and get as much flavor out of it as you can. When you do that, the acidity doesn't always feel the same intensity all the time that the wine is sitting there on your palate. It may feel particularly high at the beginning and then it drops off. Or it may feel soft at the beginning and then climbs. Or it may have peaks and troughs. So this little graph I have on this slide here is not meant to be a scientific graph or anything. But here along this axis, along the x-axis, if you imagine, is time, the time the wine spends on your palate. And again, for the purpose of tasting, I really recommend 3, 4, 5 seconds. Just leave the wine there, swill it around, try and get as much out of it as you can. So this is time along here, along the x-axis. And then on the side, on the y-axis, is how strongly you perceive the acidity. So you can see this is a fictional wine, right? This variety doesn't exist. So don't try and think that it's one thing or another thing. So in this particular case, the acidity would go up strongly at the beginning here. And then as you keep the wine on the palate longer, it would go down, it would dip down. You wouldn't feel it so much, but then it would come up again before it goes back down again. So the shape of this wine is like a curve. So not always, but a lot of the time when I talk about shape of acid structure, I'm kind of in my mind visualizing like a graph like this, where the amount of time is along the bottom here and the intensity of the acidity is along the top. There are other aspects to this shape of acidity as well, some of which, and we'll explore some of these today when we get onto the wines in just a second, are not so much about time and intensity of acidity, but they're also about where you feel the acidity in the mouth. And that too can give a sense of shape to a wine. So we'll talk about that in a little bit later. I don't want to go into that now because it sounds a bit confusing unless you have a wine in front of you when you can really experience that. So that's the shape of the acidity. So in each wine that we're going to look at when we do these sessions on white wines, I want you to think about the level of acidity, the type of the acidity, and the shape of the acidity. Those three things, I argue, when you put them together, will give you a very strong clue about what the wine you have in front of you is. Because I argue that for major varieties, each one has a slightly different acid structure to everything else. So if you can just hone down on that acid structure, you've got a very good chance of correctly identifying what that wine is. The final thing I want to say before we move on to the wines very quickly is this sounds very abstract and technical, I know, but the point really is that this is an art and not a science. So if you don't get the exact shape or you get a different adjective to describe the texture or the sensation of the acidity, that's totally fine. I just use the language that I find most helpful to me. If you can find a better, that's perfect, that's great. So with that being said, I think it's time for some wines. If you haven't got wines today, that's totally fine. I think you'll still get a lot out of it. But if you have, pour your first wine, which is going to be the Chenin Blanc. Now, please tell me in the questions box where you're your Chenin Blanc comes from. I assume that some of you have got wines from the Loire Valley, from Vouvray on Savonnières, and perhaps from Montlouis. And then I assume that some of you also maybe have got wines from South Africa or other places. So I'd be always interested to hear what you guys have got. So some people have got wines from Saumur, some from Vouvray. Both of those are great because I think they're such classic examples of Loire Chenin Blanc. Another Saumur. Saumur, you tell me in a minute, guys, when you taste the wines, but Saumur to me is usually the drier style, right, of Loire Chenin Blanc. I usually consider it a bit drier than Vouvray, which can have that residual sugar. Stellenbosch, excellent. So South Africa is always a great example. Anjou, more Loire, fantastic. So good cross section here of different styles. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have a slide queued up in just a second, which describes what I think the answers are for Chenin Blanc. But I'm not going to go forward to that because I want you guys to taste for yourself and see what you find. And then we'll see how that compares to what my description is. So the first thing I want you to do, though, before we even start talking about acid structure, is to tell me what flavors you're getting. The reason is, even though everything I just said about flavor and how I don't find it trustworthy, in spite of that, I think it's really hard not to think about flavor at all. So the best thing we can do is just do it at the beginning, and then we've done it, and then we can put it aside and just focus on acid. So if any of you guys are getting interesting flavors or aromas from your wine, please do tell me in the questions box. I think that from the Loire Valley, you should get very different aromas and flavors than from South Africa, but you guys tell me. So lanolin, Corey has got pineapple, guava, peach. No surprise, I think that wine will come from South Africa, Kathleen. Pear, floral notes, says Stanislav. Yes, absolutely. These seem to be very classic and typical notes for Loire example of Chenin Blanc. So that's very good. Excellent. So keep on smelling and tasting. But now I want you just to focus on one aspect of acid structure. And that's the first one here on this slide, which is simply the level of the acidity. Very simple. Just tell me, how much does the wine make your mouth water? If it doesn't make it water very much, then it's kind of low acidity. And if it makes it water like crazy, then it's high acidity. What kind of level of acidity do you think that your wine has? Kathleen says her example from South Africa has got high acidity. Now that might be a little bit surprising, I guess, to some people because South Africa is a warm climate, warmer climate than the Loire Valley. But I agree, Kathleen, that a South African example of Chenin can have high acidity for sure. Fred and Corey are saying they've got very high acidity, which I well believe in examples from the Loire Valley. Luciana says medium plus, and Stanislav says high, along with Elena as well. So quite a few examples of high acidity, both from South Africa and from the Loire Valley. And again, that's, I think, what I would expect from either of those locations. Chenin Blanc is just a variety that tends most of the time to show high acidity. Okay, Vidya has got medium high, good. Now, the next thing I want you to think about is where it gets a little bit more tricky. This concept of the type of acidity. Just taste the wine, don't think about the fruit or the aromas or even the level of acidity. Just think about the sensation or the texture of the acidity, or what the effect of the acidity is when it hits your mouth. Do any of those words on this slide make sense for this wine? Or do you want to use other words to describe that sensation that the acidity gives? This is the type of acid. Vidya says that she finds the acidity zesty, which is great. I love zesty. Or tingly, yeah. Very good. So both of these words, I think, zesty and tingly, they kind of mean that the acidity almost feels alive. It's almost vibrating with life and with energy. And that makes perfect sense to me in this context. Kathleen finds the acidity prickly or spiky. And Stanislav's is another vote for zesty. Good. Good. I like the range of adjectives that we've got going on here. And so while you continue thinking about that, then we can also give a try to what, again, I find the hardest category to think about, which is this concept of shape. Is there, when you hold the wine in your mouth for 5 or so seconds, is there a time during that period when you feel the acidity more intensely than the other time? Is it felt at the beginning or in the middle or at the end, or is it just constant? Is it just the same all the way through? Any opinions about that? Alice is saying high, firm, and linear acidity. Good. We got another vote for firm types of acidity. Zesty. Kathleen thinks that you get the acidity more at the end. It's felt higher at the end. Whereas Luciana says in the middle. Stanislav says the acidity is increasing or escalating, as Corey says. Fred says that it's very soft at the beginning. And Vidya says that there's a crescendo of acidity. We'll come back to that word in just a sec. Kathleen likes escalating. So increasing and escalating, I think, kind of refer to the same thing. You get an intensification of acidity throughout the time the wine is on your palate. Good. So I think a lot of excellent suggestions here. And I think really you have anticipated a lot of what I'm going to show in the next slide. I think your answers are very good. So let me move on to the Chenin Blanc slide. Here we go. So the first aspect of the acidity, I think, is the easier one. For Chenin Blanc, you're almost always going to get high acidity. That's just the nature of the variety. Again, a bit like Sauvignon Blanc or Riesling. If you don't have high acidity, maybe you shouldn't be growing Chenin Blanc in this place. I think that's very normal for Chenin Blanc. Okay, and the type of acidity. So we had a lot of zesties and prickly and spiky, and I don't disagree with those, but my own take on Chenin Blanc acidity is that, first of all, it's powerful. I mean, you're not sort of left wondering whether, oh, is the acidity really there, or I can't really feel it. No, this is a big, powerful acid structure that leaves you in no doubt that you're in the presence of a lot of acid. It's quite intense, it's quite powerful. So that's the first thing. And then I use this other word, bracing. Bracing is like, when you have the emergency landing on the plane and the air cabin crew, they tell you to brace, 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 almost as if you're going to get rocked back in your seat by the impact. I know it sounds stupid, but that's what I think about the acidity in Chenin Blanc. It kind of makes you brace. Why? Because it's so strong. It really hits you hard, perhaps more so than any other variety. That's what I mean by bracing. And certainly, of course, it can be tingly or zesty at the same time, but I find it quite bracing, quite powerful. Okay, so I'm going to come to your questions in just a sec, but let's just talk about the crescendo, the shape of the acidity. So really here, I'm just using this one word, which obviously I'm borrowing from the musical world, to describe that sensation which you guys all, I think, experienced of the sense of the acidity increasing during the time the wine spends on your palate, increasing or escalating in intensity. That's what I mean by crescendo. So in music, the crescendo is this sign here where this little hairpin, which indicates that you should gradually start playing the music louder. And to me, the acidity in Chenin Blanc gets louder during the time that the wine spends on your palate. It starts out quite soft, and you think, oh, there's not much acid in this wine. But by the end, the acid is really screaming. That's the crescendo, the growing, the increasing, the escalating acidity, which I think is such a hallmark of Chenin Blanc. Okay, so let me just see a couple of your questions here. Crescendo is the same as escalating. Yes, Vidya. Corey asks, is it because the acidity dominates the fruit? In some examples, I think, and this gets a little bit down to the regions part of this slide. In cooler climate regions, I think in the Loire Valley, particularly in dry versions, maybe if anyone's got a Sauvignon today, which can be quite an austere, ungenerous style of wine, especially in its youth, it can seem like the acidity is dominating the wine. It dominates the fruit. But I think in other examples, like for instance in South African examples or Vouvray, where perhaps there's a little bit of residual sugar, I don't think we can say that the acidity dominates the fruit, but it certainly balances it. In the case of South Africa, you have a very generous tropical fruit spectrum, which is balanced out by how intense that acidity is. So I think that's quite a nice balance. What's the difference between high and powerful? High, Claude, high is the level of the acidity. Powerful is the sensation of the acidity. So high acidity means that on the scale of low to high, it's right at the top, whereas the nature of, for instance, a Riesling might have high acidity, but it's not pretty powerful. But here, that thing that I'm talking about, the impact, the bracing nature of Chenin Blanc acidity, that's the power aspect I'm getting at with bracing, with powerful. So how do you, so Luciano is asking about how we compare do we need a kind of benchmark to compare the level of acidity of a Chenin Blanc with some other kind of variety? You don't have to, but I think it can be useful just to have something in mind, maybe a white wine that you know very well, and you know that that wine has got moderate or high acidity or whatever, and then to compare how intense you feel that acidity in this wine, the Chenin Blanc wine, and then you can use that as a measuring stick for how high or low the acidity is. So I think especially if you have a Loire example today, it's probably going to be hard for you to find a wine which has got higher acidity than the one you have right now. Of course, we can talk about Blanc de Blanc Champagne maybe, or maybe some particularly cool climate Riesling, something like that. But Chenin Blanc has got some of the highest levels of acidity for a still wine anywhere, I think, especially when it comes from the cool northern climate of the Loire Valley. Aligote Stanislavs would be another great example of a very, very high acidity white grape grown in the relatively northern climate of Bourgogne, of Burgundy, for sure. I think the difference is there's just slight difference in texture. Aligote has got quite a jagged, sharp acidity, whereas Chenin Blanc, it doesn't really have the edges, it just has that very strong, powerful structure. The other terms section of this slide, just a couple of things. Unexpected, the reason why I put unexpected in there is because when you first taste a Chenin Blanc, often you get a softness at the beginning. Now, if it's in South Africa, that's the softness of fruit, usually. There's a lot of fruit in those South African examples. And then you're thinking, oh, I'm in the presence of a warm climate, tropical tasting Chardonnay, maybe. But then that acidity just creeps up on you at the end. It's very unexpected, and it would never happen in a Chardonnay. Or if you're in a Vouvray, perhaps with a little bit of residual sugar or off dry. Again, it's quite soft at the beginning, but then the acidity comes screaming in at the end after that crescendo. So that's what I'm calling unexpected. And then the stylistic diversity as well. I think, I think I've already talked about that, the difference between the soft, rich examples from South Africa and then the austerity of Savonnière on the other hand. And somewhere in the middle, things like Montlouis or Saumur. But don't also forget sparkling Chenin Blanc, so important in the Loire Valley. And that will behave the same way. Same kind of structure. Ignore the bubbles, focus on the acid structure. You'll experience the same kind of crescendo of acidity. Fred is asking, how can you explain that the acidity has got the same shape in Vouvray and as in South Africa, even though the soils are very different? Well, simply, Fred, I think it's because this isn't so much about soil as it is about variety. What influences the taste of a wine above all is obviously the variety. Now, as wine geeks, we take that for given and we kind of focus on, soils and climates and these other things. But at the end of the day, remember that it's the variety which is going to dominate the taste of the wine. Okay, if anyone has any more questions about Chenin Blanc or about acid structure, then please say so now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next wine. The reason why I wanted to start with Chenin Blanc and why I think it's such a good example of this whole thing I'm talking about with acid structure is that to me, it has quite a clear acid structure. That crescendo is so consistent across different Chenin Blancs of whatever styles, dry, sweet, sparkling, all across the world, wherever it's grown. It's quite an easy one to kind of understand and get your head around. So if you can understand that, then you really are beginning to understand what my concept of acid structure is. And that's going to really help you as we go forward, as the varieties perhaps get a little bit more complicated. Eleanor's asking about what vertical versus horizontal is. I will answer that question, Eleanor, but let's find a wine which has got one of those two, and then I'll answer that question. Clones, Gianluca is asking, can clones have an influence? Again, I say the same thing as I was saying to Fred about the soil types. I'm sure, but ultimately the variety will always win out in terms of the acid structure. We know that, especially in some wines like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, clones are extremely important in terms of the flavor profile and other aspects of the wine. But I think I'm very confident that in structural terms, the clones and the soils do not change the structure of the wine. Okay, so why don't we pour the next wine, which is the Sauvignon Blanc. So I expect some of you are going to stay in the Loire Valley for this one, but perhaps others of you are going elsewhere. So why don't you just tell me where your wine comes from? In the case of the Sauvignon Blanc, while I pour mine. I actually went a little off-piste and got one from Napa Valley, which I thought was interesting. And just because, in the Napa Valley, this is not, I don't think, if you're thinking about Sauvignon Blanc, you're probably thinking about the Loire, or you might be thinking about New Zealand. But here's the thing, and this is really what you guys are asking about. If the structure I have in mind for Sauvignon Blanc works in Sancerre, and it's the same in Napa Valley, which couldn't be a more different climate, right? Then it would seem that the variety is really what these two have in common. Okay, people have got Sancerre. Maria's both got a Sancerre and a Marlborough. That's fantastic, Maria. You'll be able to compare two different styles and see whether the acid structure is the same. Puy-Fumé, Stellenbosch, excellent. Nice South African. Marlborough, and another Sauvignon Blanc from Napa as well, just like me, from Corey, and from Menatu Salon from the Loire for Vidia. Very good. Okay, so again, I am going to leave the Chenin Blanc slide up because again, I want you guys to do a little bit of work and tell me what you find. But the first thing, just like we did last time, let's just taste for aroma and flavor so we can get those out the way. Tell me what you're experiencing. Stanislav's is getting some blackcurrant leaf. I know exactly what you mean. It's quite a precise flavor, Stanislav's, but I know exactly what you mean. Yes. Any? Do we have any takers for gooseberry? Yeah, Kathleen finds grass and some vegetal elements. Some lime as well. That's good. Yeah, I'm of course coming from Napa Valley. I'm getting slightly more ripe aromas perhaps than from the Loire Valley. Corey's getting pineapple. Corey, would you say that is ripe yellow pineapple, or is it perhaps slightly more unripe or even greener pineapple, tinned pineapple? Again, there's a good reason why I chose not to talk about flavors in my book, because I think these quite fine definitions can sometimes be not as helpful as we think they are. But nonetheless, it's good just to focus on them, and then we can move on to structure. So saying that, let's take the first step and think about the level of acidity in your Sauvignon Blanc. Low, medium, high, very high even. What do you find? Maria and Stanislavs and Eleanor and Gianluca find high, which I also find here from Napa Valley. Kathleen likewise. Maybe I should say, is there anyone for whose wine does not show high acidity? Anyone who's only got moderate levels of acidity? And if so, please tell me where your wine comes from. I think high is pretty normal, pretty expected for Sauvignon Blanc. Corey's saying medium plus to high, but he's got a Napa example like I have, so that would be on the warmer end of the climate where Sauvignon Blanc is grown. Okay, and then the next step might be a little bit more tricky, which is the type of acidity. What's the texture or the sensation? What's a good adjective, a good word to describe the type of the acidity that you're experiencing in the Sauvignon Blanc? I can go back to the first slide, just so you can get a few clues to see whether any of those words are useful to you. But there's many more. I just chose some random ones on this slide. Gianluca has bracing, like the Chenin Blanc, very good. Stanislavs has piercing, attacking. Yes, a kind of Stanislav seems to be getting at the fact that it's kind of an aggressive acidity in some way. Maria has electric, Kathleen has zesty, Lydia has firm or broad, Kathleen has prickly, and Luciana is another vote for zesty. Good. Yeah, I love all of those ones. I think a wide range, but I think we're all getting at the sensation, again, perhaps even more vividly than in the Chenin Blanc, that there's something really vibrant about the acidity in Sauvignon Blanc. Aggressive makes it sound negative, which is not, but it captures something of the energy and of the impact that the Sauvignon Blanc acidity has. I think that's very typical of the type of acidity. And Nisha says prickly, and Kathleen says it's like humming. Good. Okay, so the final question is always the most difficult, about the shape of the acidity. Is there a moment in the time spent on the palate where you feel it more strongly than at other times, or is it just consistent? And especially in Sauvignon Blanc, something that might help us to understand the shape is to think a little bit about where physically in your mouth you feel the acidity most strongly. It can be helpful to think about that in the case of this particular wine. Okay, so Kathleen finds the acidity on the front of the mouth and on the gums. And Luciana likewise says she finds her gums get drier, so that kind of indicates that the acidity might be felt there. Gianluca finds that it's pretty consistent level of acidity. Good. Maria offers another vote for on the gums. So quite a few people are saying on the gums. Good. Kathleen finds also a crescendo of acidity, so quite similar in some ways to the Chenin Blanc, really just from down the road in the Loire Valley. And Vidya finds the gums and the tongue. Good. So Alice says it seems to arc. Strongest sensation on the mid palate, on the side of the tongue, and in the cheeks. So we've got a couple of votes for tongue, but there is also quite a strong emphasis in your comments on tongue and gums and cheeks. So kind of like around the edges of the mouth. Okay, and the same Eleanor is sort of in the same area when she says on the side of the tongue. Good. Okay, so I think you guys have done great again. Let's go forward to the Sauvignon Blanc slide. So of course, the level of acidity is high. Perhaps in very warm climates, it might be moderate to high, but generally speaking, high is a given in Sauvignon Blanc. The type of the acidity, a couple of people said prickly. I think if you said zesty, I think it's very, very close. I think we're in the same ballpark. The idea of prickly, to me, excuse me, is connected with the first word I've written here, which is bright. Bright like a light illuminating through a piece of paper, but the piece of paper's got these very tiny little pinpricks, holes in them. So the light seems to just come through these little pinpricks. So little pinpricks of light are bright. And so the acidity doesn't seem to be sort of just general. It seems to be here and here and here and here, kind of pricking the inside of your mouth. That's what I mean by prickly, and that's what I mean by bright. Bright in the sense that it kind of illuminates the rest of the wine. It's kind of a strange sensation. And I've also included in there the word tart. Now we know that tart can be a kind of sort of a negative word when it comes to acidity. But I think if there's any wine which often, but not always, features tart acidity, it would be Sauvignon Blanc. So what I mean by that is the acidity feels just a little bit sour. Now, again, this is very dependent on the climate where you're at. So if you're in the Loire Valley, you're much more likely to experience that sensation than if you're in a warmer climate in the USA or, excuse me, South Africa or New Zealand even. So the level is high, the type, zesty, prickly, bright. And then let's just talk for a second about the shape. This is where it gets a bit more abstract. Just give me one sec. Luciana agrees with bright for her example. The shape of the acidity. Now this really comes to the point about where in the mouth you feel it. And as many of you said, you feel it on the gums, and someone said they felt it on the cheeks as well. So you put those two together, and that's what I call around the edges of the mouth, because they're the kind of limit of the mouth, right? So what we're doing here is we're talking about physically in your mouth, around the edge, gums, and then also I agree with the people who said tongue as well. This is something where I do think you do get a little bit of a tingling sensation on the gums. But to me, the emphasis on the acidity, in spite of that, is around the edge. And for that reason, I was thinking about this last night. You will not find this in the book because I've been trying to think a little harder about Sauvignon Blanc because I didn't really feel like I was getting it very well. And this is something I'm going to have to amend in the second edition of the book. That emphasis on the edge of the mouth almost makes it feel to me like a circle around the mouth, around the extremities of the mouth, the gums and the cheeks. And so to me, rather than saying circular, because it's kind of all around like a ball, I'm going to go with spherical. It's like, it feels like there's a kind of ball inside your mouth. That's like the spherical acidity. And the other aspect of that is that there's I think an emphasis somehow on that acidity moving outwards very gently. If, as I believe you are correct, about the acidity first being felt on the tongue, I would say that in time, it's first felt on the tongue, and then it's felt around the edge of the mouth. So there's almost a sensation of movement from the tongue around to the edges of the mouth. So this kind of outward spread of acidity. So that's what I mean by spherical. Stanislav says the perimeter of the mouth. Yeah, absolutely. I love perimeter. Luciana agrees with spherical. So Vidya asks, if the type of the acidity is firm or broad, does it always correlate with the shape being spherical all around the mouth? I guess I would say it's probably a video. I don't want to like try and define things too narrowly because everyone experiences slightly different things. But generally, if we find firm or broad acidity, I'd be less inclined to say that it's going to be all around the mouth, because usually firm or broad means it's tucked into the fruit in some way, in some capacity. Whereas here, I think we have the opposite sensation, that it's, and this is a point, thank you for bringing it up, that I really want to get into. If you look at the other terms section of this slide, one of the key aspects to me of Sauvignon Blanc is the way that the acidity is not always or even often very well integrated into the fruit or the body of the wine. What does that mean? In a wine like Riesling or Chardonnay, the acidity is always inside the fruit or the body of the wine. It's kind of tucked in there. It's right in the middle. In Sauvignon Blanc and in a couple of other wines like Muscadet, maybe like Aligoté, the fruit is here and the acidity is here. And they don't always meet. In this case, you feel it very vividly because the fruit, as always, the fruit is usually felt on the tongue and the acidity is around the edge of the mouth. So the fruit and the acidity are kind of detached from one another. And that's what I mean by separate, not integrated. The acidity is not integrated into the fruit, into the body. And that to me is a very Sauvignon Blanc sensation. What I'm going to talk about finally is just a little bit about these regions. The Loire Valley, which most of you have, many of you have, I think that lack of integration of the acidity is going to be felt most vividly because it's a cool climate sensation. There is an exception to that though, which is that if you have one of those higher end Sancerres, you know, the ones that might cost 40 or 50 euros, single vineyards from the best producers, often in those ones, I think with reduced yields, a bit more concentration of fruit, the acidity does feel a little bit more integrated. But a regular Menetou Salon, Touraine, Quincy, Puy-Fumé Sancerre, those ones often is where you will feel the acidity most strongly around the edge of the mouth and the fruit in the middle. Bordeaux, a little bit more complicated because you've got the blend with Semillon. In that case, what you're going to find is that the acid structure does change just because Semillon has got quite a different acid structure. Semillon is an example of a wine which has got a horizontal or linear acid structure. And what that means is that it stays consistent throughout the time the wine spends on your palate. There's no ups and downs. So that's a good example of a wine where the acidity is integrated into the fruit. So if you think about what's happening in white Bordeaux, a blend of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc, the acidity in Sauvignon Blanc, of course, is going outwards, but the fruit and the acid of Semillon are in the middle. So really, you have the best of both worlds. The bright acidity around the edge from the Sauvignon and that linear acidity driving the wine forward from the Semillon. So it's quite an interesting blend. And then the New World countries for Sauvignon Blanc, of course, New Zealand is classic. I think New Zealand mostly behaves quite like the Loire Valley because it's a cool climate region. Perhaps a little bit more integration into the fruit, but I still think the acidity can feel a little bit tart and separate from the fruit. And then in warmer climates, you're going to find the acidity a bit more tucked in there. Okay, any more questions about Sauvignon Blanc? Any more observations anyone wants to make from the wine in their glass? I think, just from my perspective, when you put these two alongside each other, Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc, then you realize that even though the Loire Valley is home to both, you are in quite a different world in terms of the acid structure. The very defined crescendo acid structure of Chenin Blanc. And on the other hand, this kind of prickly around the mouth sensation of Sauvignon Blanc. Now, one person did say, and I agree with you, that on account of that outward spread of acidity, it can feel like Sauvignon Blanc is also a bit of a crescendo of acidity. I totally understand what you mean. I just think there's a bit more acidity even from the beginning of the Sauvignon Blanc than there is in Chenin Blanc. And that may be the difference. Chenin Blanc is so backloaded, whereas Sauvignon, there is some at the beginning, especially on the tongue, but then it kind of radiates outwards towards the end. Okay, Sauvignon Blanc, good. So why don't we move forward to the final wine for today, which is the Assyrtiko. So tell me where your wine comes from. I assume that most of you are in Greece somewhere. I know there is some Assyrtiko grown in Australia and in maybe another New World country, I don't know. But most of you will be in Greece, whether you're in Santorini or other parts of Greece. And again, what I want to do with this variety, and the reason why I chose Assyrtiko, you might be thinking, oh, Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc are famous, important, international, great varieties. Assyrtiko is not. Why do you want to put Assyrtiko into this session? Well, for two reasons. First, well, three reasons. First, I love it. I love Greece. I love the islands. I love Santorini. So it's just a sort of sentimental thing on my part. Second, I honestly believe Assyrtiko is one of the greatest of all white grape varieties, and we need to talk more about it. It's so underappreciated for how complex and interesting and age-worthy it is. And the third reason is that for our purpose of talking about wine structure, this is a third example today, which is going to have a very prominent and strong and clear acid structure. So it's a really good place to start a series of webinars like this, because like the other two today, you can really pin down what it means and to have an acid structure through the use of Assyrtiko. Okay, so yes, we do have quite a few people who've got the Santorini. Alice has got one from Crete. I'm sure that will be fantastic. Another from Crete. Nisha has got Sigalas, which is one of my favorite wineries from Santorini. Yes, I too have got a Santorini from another wonderful producer there, Argyros. Okay, so let's just go back a slide or two to our little introduction. And have our first taste of the Assyrtiko, the Santorini, or the other islands from where it comes. And now you tell me, first of all, about flavors and aromas. I'm a bit more interested, I have to admit, in the flavors or aromas of Santorini than I am in Sauvignon Blanc. I find Sauvignon Blanc, we sort of know what to expect, but Santorini or Assyrtiko is a bit more of an unexpected or unknown quantity for most of us. So tell me what you're getting in flavors and aromas. Okay, so Inga is getting salinity, saltiness, yes. Kathleen is getting dust, minerals, hydrangea flower, lemon, caramel, and saltiness. Some stony, smoky, woolly notes, lemon and lime, some more stoniness, some minerality, and again, that lemon, lime, citrus notes. I think absolutely I agree with you all. Mine is very aromatic, almost a hint of kind of chamomile or waxiness, or even like a bit like petrol, like gasoline, like a Riesling almost. Very interesting. A lot going on there for sure. Okay, And then how about the level of acidity in your wine? Eleanor says stony minerality, which I love. I always think it's a good idea, by the way, if you're a wine professional or if you write about wine or talk to groups about wine, try not just to say mineral. I think we kind of throw mineral and minerality out there all the time, but for a lot of people, it's a bit meaningless if you're outside the wine community. And also, I think that it's one of those things that if you can't qualify it further, then it's a bit meaningless. So if you say chalky minerality or smoky or steely, then that to me is a lot more meaningful than just saying minerality. And certainly I think that this is a good opportunity with a wine like an Assyrtiko to be able to do that. Starfruit, caramel. Okay, in terms of the level of acidity, both Gianluca and Maria are saying very high, and Kathleen saying high. Solomon Fred is actually saying a very interesting comment, which we'll come back to, that there's not that much fruit. There's not that much fruit on the nose. Maybe it's the other elements like the saltiness or the smokiness or the smoky, stony minerality which dominates. So there seems to be a consensus among everyone that this is another wine with high acidity. So I hope you guys were prepared for some acidity today, because by goodness, we've got a lot of it in these three wines. So I think high or very high is great. Okay, and what about the type of acidity? What kind of words can we use that capture the essence of how that acidity feels in the mouth? Okay. Maria says bracing. Nisha says it's not spherical. I agree, Nisha. It's not spherical this time. Powerful. Yeah, powerful. I agree with for sure. Bracing. Another person says bracing. Corey says it's tart and zesty. Eleanor says it's spiky. Luciana says, can I say sparkling acidity? You can say whatever you like, Luciana, but I know what you mean. There's a kind of energy to the wine that pops up everywhere. So a bit like the Sauvignon Blanc, where we felt like it was kind of pricking almost the inside of our mouth, maybe a bit like that. Vidya is another vote for bracing. Stanislav says tingling. Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the power or the intensity of the acidity, what do you guys think about that? If we're just focusing on the how strong that acidity, not the level of it, but how intense that acidity is, do you find it to be powerful like the Chenin Blanc, or perhaps sort of more moderate like the Sauvignon Blanc? Kathleen and Maria say they think it's powerful. And so does Vidya and Eleanor. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that one of the dominant features of Assyrtiko is just the pure strength of the acidity. We talked about the strength of the Chenin Blanc acidity felt on the finish, but here, what a dominant feature of the wine it is, really right from the beginning. Powerful. Okay, weighty, Nisha says. Yeah, so that's another aspect of it. It almost as if the acidity itself has got some kind of weight to it. But that's a really good point, Nisha. We're going to come back to that in just a sec. Okay, and then finally, let's talk about the shape of the acidity, where, again, ask yourself a bit of the question that we were talking about with the Sauvignon Blanc. Where in your mouth do you feel it? Not just, you know, is it high or low at different points, although think about that as well, but also where physically in your mouth do you perceive that acidity most strongly? So Nisha says it's like pulling the wine down to the lower part of your mouth. Okay. Kathleen finds it on the gums again and on the tongue. And Nisha and Corey both say on the tongue also. And Kathleen says on the front of the mouth, which I sort of interpret as meaning the gums. Tongue says Stanislav's, and Vidya says the gums and the cheeks again, so more on the side. And Maria also says on the perimeter around the edge of the mouth. Alice says on the cheeks. So again, quite a few votes for gums and cheeks. I'm on the same page as you guys. I agree with that for sure. Let's just see now what I came up with. So here I am in Santorini last summer, having a great time at Domain Hatzidakis, one of the great producers of Assyrtiko in Santorini. A wonderful visit, a wonderful summer. These are all my pictures. Of course, sadly couldn't visit this summer, but I hope to be back in more normal times, but happy memories for sure. Now, let's see what I'm saying here. The level of acidity, I think we agreed, is high. I think that's an easy one. And then the type of acidity, I've written hard or structural. So when someone was talking about the sort of density of the acidity, that it's, and we talked about how intense, how powerful the acidity is. That's what I'm trying to get at when I say hard. It's almost as if the acidity feels more like a solid than a liquid. It's a kind of crazy thing to say. It's got a very rigid profile, which is what I mean by structural. Of course, it's kind of stupid to call acid structure structural, but in a more perhaps demonstrative and obvious way than with the other two examples we've looked at today, the acidity here seems to really be the superstructure that supports the rest of the wine. Okay, and then the shape of the acidity. I need to explain this one a little bit. Vitali says he or she finds the acidity on the roof of the mouth. Now, this is quite close to what I'm saying here. This is what I'm calling the floor to ceiling acidity. What does that mean? It means that in general terms, I find the Assyrtiko acidity to be felt most strongly at the top of the mouth and at the bottom of the mouth. So kind of similar in some ways to the Sauvignon Blanc acidity all around the mouth, but here perhaps less emphasis on maybe on the cheeks, on the side, and more just on the top and the bottom, on the roof of the mouth and on the floor. So someone said that it's a bit like a box, and that kind of gets closer to what I'm saying, that I find that the weight of the acidity is kind of dragged down to the bottom, but also lifted to the top. It almost creates a kind of square, but especially on the roof and on the floor of the mouth. So that's what I'm calling the floor to ceiling sensation. It's kind of, again, I'm trying to use a kind of abstract idea or vision or concept or an image, which is difficult to apply to a liquid which is in your mouth. I understand that, it's very abstract. But that's kind of where I feel it. So very powerful structural sensation. And the floor to ceiling analogy is me trying to get at the fact that this is the most obvious example of how acid can structure the mouthfeel of a wine, which means the way that it gives a sense of shape or architecture to the fruit. It holds everything together and gives it a shape in the mouth, so it doesn't just kind of flop around. It's a very structural kind of acidity. Okay, there is a key part of this discussion, though, which we would not be doing justice to the acid structure of Assyrtiko if we didn't pay some heed to, which is here in the other terms section. And the first word here, which is phenolic. So Assyrtiko to me is one of the most phenolic of the white grape varieties. What does phenolic mean? Phenolics are the solid substances which are left in white wines from the skins and other solid parts of the grape. So of course, not like they're floating around in the glass. You'd have to have a microscope to see them. But Assyrtiko is one of those varieties where it almost feels as if you can chew part of the wine. It's got this kind of chewy texture. And that's phenolics. These tiny little bits of solid left over from the grapes, which are in the wine, and they add to the sensation of structure. Now, the really interesting thing for me about Assyrtiko is the way that the acidity and the phenolic content go hand in hand to kind of double up on this sense of structure, of the architecture of the wine in the mouth. So yes, the acidity is powerful. Yes, it's felt very firmly and strongly and consistently, but also the phenolics are adding to that sensation. The chewiness of the wine somehow is a continuity of the acidity. They support and reinforce one another. So the acidity by itself would make Assyrtiko a very structured wine, but the phenolics also double down on that sensation, which makes Assyrtiko behave more closely like a red wine with tannin structure than almost any other white grape variety. What do you guys think? Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm talking about phenolics, what phenolics are, the phenolic content of the wine, the chewiness, the substantial kind of textured thing in there alongside the acidity? I think both of those two things together make it a big, powerful wine. To me, that's one of the glorious things about Assyrtiko, because anyone who's been to Santorini or the other Greek islands in July or August will know that these are very hot places, very dry, hot, windswept places. And it does seem unlikely that you could find a fresh white wine from these regions. But the acidity of Assyrtiko is naturally high, which is great, so that helps. But the role of the phenolics isn't just to create structure in the mouth, but it also gives the impression of freshness. How does it do that? It does it by creating this sense of attack in the mouth, of something kind of solid that you get your teeth into, which along with the acidity creates this sensation of not of flabbiness or of softness, but the opposite, of structure and vibrancy. So I think phenolics are wonderful for doing two things in Assyrtiko. Yes, structuring the wine, which by the way is fantastic for the ageability of Assyrtiko, one of the most age-worthy of the white grape varieties, but also for creating that sense of attack and of freshness and of life in a wine from a very warm climate. Okay, let's see what you guys say. Luciana is talking about it's a little like tannins, and yeah, just Eleanor commenting again on the acidity in this kind of warm climate. So that's what I'm getting at with the phenolic and the textural elements of the wine. So if the floor to ceiling acidity or the hard structural, all that language doesn't really speak to you, nonetheless you can identify Assyrtiko by the combination of high acidity and high phenolic content. Another wine that behaves in a slightly similar way and which is also, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, grown by the coast is Albarino, also a wine with high acidity and high phenolic content. But Assyrtiko to me has got more concentrated, more powerful fruit and an overall more powerful profile. Remember all the things I just said, I'm saying without reference to flavor one bit. The only thing I would say, though, with reference to the phenolics in particular, is that when we were talking about flavors at the beginning, a lot of people were commenting on lemon and lime. And I do think that if phenolics in white wine have any kind of flavor sensation, then often it's those things, especially lime, a bit like the pith of a lime. I think that gets quite close to the phenolic idea in this wine, in the Assyrtiko. So Corey is asking for a comparison of this style of phenolic wine with a wine from Alsace. It doesn't really matter which grape variety, but we know that wines from Alsace in France are pressed quite hard on the finish. So they often can have a little bit of bite or attack of phenolics on the finish of those wines. And again, if you think, if you know your Alsatian varieties, let's leave aside Riesling for now, but if you think about Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, these are varieties without an abundance of acidity, maybe moderate at most, perhaps even lower than that. So why would you want to have phenolic content in those wines? Precisely because you're compensating for that little lack of acidity. It gives a little bit of bite and freshness. On the finish, I also think that phenolic content can be a check on oxidation of fruit. I think it helps keep everything fresher. And so often the place where you find oxidation, that kind of, in white wines, that kind of nutty fruit, which is not fresh anymore, often you find that most readily, if not on the nose, then on the finish of the wine. So in the case of Alsace, and when we come to it next week, in the case of Italian white wines, the result of quite firm pressing is that you get the phenolic content at the end on the finish after you've swallowed, which is exactly where you might otherwise risk having oxidation. So that's quite interesting to think about structurally. But we can talk, remind me to talk more about that next week when we're going to do an Alsace variety and we're going to do an Italian variety. But here, I don't think it's so much a question, Corey, of the pressing as it is in Alsace in Italy. I think here, this is just Assyrtiko being Assyrtiko. I think really this is how it comes. Although obviously in a big structured wine like this, how you press is always going to be a big decision for the winemaker. Okay, so Nisha's reminding me of something I mentioned earlier about the fruit or lack thereof in Assyrtiko. So you can see here in the other terms I've written salty, herbal, savory. And when I asked you guys to give the descriptions of the aromas and flavors you were getting, you came up with a lot of things associated with minerality or rockiness or stoniness or smokiness. And I completely agree with you. I think one of the really fascinating things and things I love about Assyrtiko is that the focal point of the wine is not fruit. Now, that might seem like a weird thing to say because surely any wine, especially young white wine, is about fruit, and that's what we want it to be about, and that's what consumers want it to be about. Well, I think the really cool thing about Assyrtiko, in fact, is the way that in this very hot climate, which would perhaps, if the focus was on fruit, would make slightly soft, maybe overripe fruit flavors. It's almost as if the grape is saying, nope, that's not what I want to do in this climate. My focus is going to be more on expressing where I come from, which results in the saltiness and the smokiness and all these other, the phenolics, all these other crazy elements to the wine. I'm not saying that because it's close to the sea, it's salty or anything crazy like that. I'm just saying that these are the characteristics that seem to emerge naturally from Assyrtiko, and an abundant fruitiness isn't one of them. So a comparison with Albarino, on the other hand, which I talked about, would be a confusion for this wine, because that's also a high acid, high phenolic wine, is that Albarino would have more fruit, often has that kind of orange blossom nose and very generous kind of lime cordial flavors. So that would be a big difference between the two. But it's something just to think about sometimes. I often think about in wines, especially wines from Europe. Is this wine really about fruit, and is it trying to be about fruit? I'm not saying that Assyrtiko, because it's not so focused on fruit, is better than any other variety, by no means. But it's just something, if you're trying to make and to judge and to assess Assyrtiko on the grounds of its fruitiness, you might be kind of missing the point, and you might want to think about your categories, that's all. Okay, I'm just looking at a few of your questions here. Phenolics in wine, does it have to do with skin contact? Yes, Elena, but remember, skin contact can simply mean the time between you cut the grape off the vine and when you crush it in the winery. That also counts as skin contact. We don't have to put skins in the vat here like they might do if you're making an orange wine or something like that. So skin contact is a very broad term, but for sure, of course, the longer time before the fermentation where the grapes remain in their skins, you are likely to kind of leach out some more of those phenolics. Stanislav is asking about serving temperature. Certainly with a wine like Assyrtiko, because it's more full-bodied, more powerful, and behaves a little bit more like a red wine, I could definitely have that served at a slightly higher temperature to the Sauvignon Blanc and to the Chenin Blanc, which certainly I'd serve cooler, you know, at 10 degrees C or 50 Fahrenheit, because I think those wines can risk sometimes the fruit being a bit flabby, even though there's tons of acid there. If you warm them up, sometimes the fruit can lose its freshness, its vibrancy just a little bit. And does the serving temperature affect the acid structure? I don't think it affects the acid structure, but I do think it's possible that you might not be able to perceive it so well if the fruit is a bit labored, a bit heavy. Okay. Our time is up, guys. Please do email me any further questions. If I've cut you off and you've just thought about your great question, please don't hesitate to email me. In the meantime, I think I'm going to see most of you same time next week. We will be talking about 3 more great varieties with 3 more very different acid structures to what we looked at today. So same time next week. Look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, guys.